Did Venti fall off? Well, a ton of players have been asking me if Venti is still good, or if he's been washed away by Hoyoverse for being too strong. And in a way, yes, Venti has been nerfed pretty dang hard, at least during Inazuma. Hoyoverse just really hates performing musicians, I don't know what it is. Creating tons of enemies who can't be moved or lifted and throwing them all together in harder content alludes to a possibility of Hoyoverse intentionally phasing Venti out of the game or nerfing him into the ground. It would be wrong to say that he hasn't gotten worse, just because in context of high-end content, he's significantly less useful than he used to be just based on the Inazuma playstyle that's being enforced. But many players don't look at the whole picture when they're referring to Venti and discussing the subject. So today, in this video, I'm going to be going over all of the good and bad about our favorite bard. With that being said, my name is Braxophone, and let's talk about Venti. When Venti first released alongside Genshin Impact, he was overlooked by a lot of players, at least for 3 or so days. I'm not really sure if it was his appearance, or if players who were just new to the gacha games at the time thought that they couldn't get Diluc or Keqing on his banner. Once players began to understand Genshin Impact combat and the value of crowd control though, the community started to show some interest in the bard. Eventually, social media caught on and boom, Venti was one of the most broken characters in the game, if not the most broken character from release. It's funny to think about how at this point, most players didn't even understand the value of the Viridescent Venerer set. He was broken even without it. But you know how the rest goes, community finds it, clickbait videos and thumbnails, people spend money, etc. But what actually makes Venti good? Most of you probably know the answer, but in case you don't, here's what Venti is able to do. Venti is an Anemo unit, meaning his kit revolves around movement in some way, whether that's moving enemies or moving your own character. With his skill, he deals damage with an updraft of Anemo damage, and if you hold it, you can actually use it to glide upwards. It can deal high damage, and it generates a bunch of energy for Venti. But there's more that actually makes Venti strong. His burst is basically a giant crowd control vortex that's going to bring in enemies with a strong pull, lift them if they're not a huge or heavy model, and continuously deal Anemo damage over time. It's a lot of Anemo damage, but not only that, Venti's burst can also get infused with an element to continuously deal swirl damage on top of the Anemo damage, and reapply that element to those enemies, opening up room for tons of different reaction-based comps, and really just making all the content in the game super easy. He also refunds 15 energy to himself after his burst, and 15 energy to any character of the element that was infused in his burst. Just as an example, if you were using Yanfei and you infused Venti's burst with Pyro, all Pyro characters, including Yanfei, would see 15 energy restored on top of all of the other damage Venti provides. And of course, being an Anemo unit, Venti can also utilize the Viridescent Venerer 4-piece set, which shreds enemy resistances based off of the swirl reaction. All in all, this character was pretty broken from the start, but he also got buffed in 1.6 when Hoyoverse, or MiHoYo at the time, buffed swirl damage scaling by level, making it more worthwhile to level your Anemo units to 90 and deal tons more swirl damage. This wasn't the only thing that the elemental mastery buffs did, but the main point is that Venti saw a lot of positive changes based on both the community gaining better understanding of the meta, as well as the developers buffing the characters indirectly. He's amazingly good at pulling enemies in to deal damage and quickly cleaning up any non-boss enemies you come across in the overworld. He also trivializes a lot of the Spiral Abyss floors, and for an account that hasn't gotten access to floors 9 through 12 yet, Venti's value is huge. However, when Inazuma released, we stopped seeing Venti played as much. Now, obviously, we had a new Anemo unit, Kazuha, who came into the game swinging with a powerful kit, but surely he wasn't so strong that he power crept and replaced Venti, right? Well, let's talk about what happened to Venti and his downsides. First off, to answer the question I just asked, no, Kazuha did not power creep Venti. Power creep would imply that Venti is a weaker unit than Kazuha, and that Kazuha replaces Venti in most teams that Venti would initially be in, when in reality they both just perform well in different content, rather than one being objectively better than the other. Unless you consider the fact that Venti lifts some enemies out of reach of some characters, thus limiting its synergy, but I don't really count that. I feel like that's kind of a non-issue, just pair him with different characters, lol. But Venti still does see less play than he used to. This is for a number of reasons. One is obviously just that he's an older unit, so over time people are going to replace older units with new ones because that's the fun thing to do. Another one is that Sucrose saw a huge spike in popularity and usage after the Elemental Mastery buffs, not because she changed a ton, but mostly because Anemo was more popular and on people's radar. With Sucrose being such a powerful 4-star unit, buffing your team with Elemental Mastery, Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers, and Elemental Damage bonus with C6, it's hard not to build her, even if you do have Venti. Another reason is that Spiral Abyss changed to be more boss-oriented, meaning that Venti lost out on his crowd control, or at least a large portion of it. The other side of that is that the non-boss enemies that we did see implemented across the 2.x series of updates were largely unliftable, could teleport, or were completely immune to being moved around by Anemo Suction. Combine this with the fact that Kazuha released right in 1.6, and there is a large reason why Venti isn't played as much as he used to be. Kazuha has similar utility to Venti, but is stronger in different areas. Both Kazuha and Venti deal high swirl damage and Anemo damage, and don't have much of a problem utilizing their elemental bursts, though Venti still has it slightly easier in that department. But Kazuha's burst activates over a huge area, which makes unmovable enemies less of an issue, because you're just gonna bring the burst to them instead. Kazuha also has an extra buff that Venti doesn't have, the ability to give elemental damage bonus to your team. His elemental damage bonus combined with the Viridescent Venerer 4-piece set made playing elemental carries feel absolutely amazing, just due to the huge buff they'd get. Like Venti, Kazuha also can bring enemies close together, but with his elemental skill, which has a lower cooldown than Venti's burst. Kazuha can lift enemies with his skill, but he can't keep them lifted like Venti can, and the pull really isn't that strong, but it's a powerful utility to have on a skill cooldown rather than a burst. But with that being said, Kazuha still hasn't power crept Venti at all. The largest reason that Venti isn't played now is because when enemies can't be moved, Venti loses out on a large portion of his kit and damage, whereas Kazuha brings the burst to enemies and gets a ton of value out of his buff. Venti was no longer seen as a necessity in a lot of meta teams at the time, and even though he still has a lot of powerful options for meta teams, he's used a lot less for current content, because crowd control seems less effective, which makes him seem like a much worse unit than Kazuha or Sucrose, just because both of them can provide tons of value even without the crowd control. With enemies that can't be moved, Sucrose and Kazuha seem like more powerful units by a long shot, and they kind of are in that specific instance. And of course you can make arguments for Sucrose and Kazuha just based off of the team that you're running, but the point I'm trying to make is that Venti lost out on a pretty big core function of his kit when Inazuma released. With that being said though, Venti hasn't gone anywhere, and he's still not going to be going anywhere for a while, but I'm going to explain that in the next section because you need to know this if you're thinking about pulling for this character. Despite Venti being significantly less useful than he used to be, he's still very good. You gotta remember that Venti was absolutely broken overpowered before Inazuma. Even if you take away a portion of his kit, he's still very, very strong. And as evidence of this, Venti is still used in some top teams, with a major example being Morgana, featuring Mona, Ganyu, Venti, and Diona. Against any non-boss enemies, Morgana and variants of it completely demolish their health bars with the power of Permafreeze, Viridescent Venerer, Mona's Omen buff, area-wide damage, and more. But even outside of Morgana, you can put Venti in any team that's reaction based, and a lot of the time Venti will make that team better. And in most event and overworld content, Venti makes it incredibly easy. Actually, fun fact, I refused to play Venti for a lot of my time in Genshin because I felt like he made the game too easy. For some players that's fun to play though, so if you want Genshin to be on easy mode, you know who to pull for. But of course, everyone's opinion is subjective. With the Anemo Archon, you can still hit bosses and large enemies with his burst even if they're not directly sucked into it. And he still uses Viridescent Venerer to debuff enemies and generates a ton of energy with his skill. On top of that, he has a 15 energy refund, which is actually a ton of energy. A lot of players underestimate how strong a 15 energy refund is. For a 60 cost burst, that's 25% of your gauge. He's an amazing debuffer, damage dealer, and battery. And on top of that, though free-to-play weapons may not be his best weapons, Venti functions with basically anything you throw on him. Why? Because with the exception of bosses and heavy enemies, his entire kit is fairly unconditional. Free-to-play weapons work on him because you don't need a great weapon to get enemies to be sucked up and forced to take tons of damage. Though he may not be the best possible Anemo pick against enemies from Inazuma and bosses, there are plenty of enemies in the game that you can take full advantage of his kit for, and as the game expands, you'll meet even more. The latest expansion wasn't necessarily the best for Venti, but it's unlikely that every single major patch will continue to hurt his viability ability. You may not need Venti for content in Genshin Impact, but he's definitely one of the stronger characters in the game, and will continue to be until Anemo as a whole becomes useless, which will hopefully be never. If you're on edge about pulling for Venti, there's not a straightforward answer that's yes or no, because like everything in Genshin Impact, it depends on your account, the teams you're running, and the content that we're in. I'm personally a believer that Kazuha will rerun very soon, and for current content in Inazuma, specifically the enemies and bosses we deal with, Kazuha's generally a better pick. But that doesn't mean that will always be the case. We have all of Teyvat to explore. I can't tell you for sure that you need Venti, but I can tell you that you can't go wrong picking him up. With all that being said, thanks everyone for watching. If you've enjoyed it, make sure to come hang out on Twitch. We'll be doing Ayato polls, testing, and gameplay when he releases. Make sure to subscribe if you're not already, comment on this video if it helped you out, and I will catch you guys next time.